Today we're going to be joined by Christopher Holton. We are joined by Christopher. Christopher is with the Center for Security Policy, which is an essential organization giving us up-to-date and important information about what is going on in our country with respect to national security. Christopher, welcome to The Current Word. Thank you so much for calling us today.
Well, thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir. All right, so let's get right to it. So you published an article today about the southern border and national security and terrorist threats. And so let's back up just a second. We want to get to that, but let's just get quickly your take on what's going on with the partial government shutdown, President Trump, the wall, border security, the Democrats. Let's just kind of get that out there and see what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I can't find anybody who has been affected by the partial government shutdown yet. I don't know. I guess I travel in the wrong circles, but it seems to have been a non-event. I think this is all political posturing, and I think that this is an attempt to force President Trump to capitulate on his pledge to build a border wall. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it's all about. And I think that's why the Democrats will not compromise at all and will not come to the bargaining table. They did the same thing to George H.W. Bush many years ago when they convinced him to break his no new taxes pledge. And that, in my opinion, ended up costing his presidency, because that was his most famous promise in his campaign. The most famous promise in President Trump's campaign, of course, was to build the wall. So I think that's what they're up to.
Yeah, so again, I agree with you. It's my understanding that the first time that federal employees would miss a paycheck would be this Friday, if they would. The 11th. That was my understanding. I don't think so. That would be the number one thing is for the employees, those that are impacted. We understand that, but also the credit unions and the unions are busily working to help those people who would miss a paycheck, loaning them money or in some way helping them to bridge the gap until those checks are actually do come out. So the other issue is the people that the services, and we've been talking about that in the other half of the show, about how private businesses are stepping in at the parks and in other places. Our state even has said that the fact that the food stamp program and other things could possibly be impacted, but that the state is going to be able to cover that and is going to take care of it. So to that point, yeah. So
when the mainstream media is doing reports on people who didn't get to see the pandas at the National Zoo, as an example of how horrible this government shutdown is, you know that it's really not that big of a deal.
Yeah, and there was an article on our own NOLA.com, which I know you live in the area, so you are familiar with that. They put a headline that 3 people were killed at national parks. And they infer from that if the government hadn't been shut down, a person wouldn't have fallen down and hit his head, or somebody wouldn't have gone off of a cliff. Although these are horrible and horrific incidents, which we are sympathetic to, putting them as being caused by the government shutdown is really a stretch. All right, so let's get now to your other point, which is that the shutdown is I think this would be quoting you correctly, that what President Trump is doing in order to secure funding for the southern border is a worthwhile effort. So let's talk about that, why you think it's a worthwhile effort.
Well, it's a national security issue. There's no question about it. And this is the most fundamental aspect of providing for the common defense, is having a secure border. Without borders, you really don't have a nation. And our sovereignty is really supreme. And it's the constitutional duty of the President of the United States and, frankly, the members of Congress to provide for that common defense. And we have an extremely porous border. It's been highlighted on the southern border, but the reality is that the border with Canada is also porous as well. And one thing I hear from people on the left is that the national security aspect of this is exaggerated, and I've even heard Geraldo Rivera claim that there is no terrorist threat on the southern border, that there is not a single credible instance of any type of terrorist threat on the southern border. And when I heard him say that, I just couldn't help myself. I have OCD, so I had to sit down and write that report. Ended up being 9 pages long. But because I knew from courses that I had taken from an organization called UnderstandingTheThreat.com, that there were definitely documented incidents on the southern border of terrorists infiltrating our border, being apprehended on our border, and planning to attack the United States through the southern border. Numerous incidents, which I listed in my report that you cited. So essentially, if someone says that there's no terrorist threat on the southern border, they're either ignorant or they're dishonest. There is no other possibility, because there is a terrorist threat on the southern border, and it dates back to before 9/11, and it has been consistent throughout the years from a variety of jihadist groups. Hamas has infiltrated the southern border. Hezbollah is a big problem on the southern border. Al-Qaeda has been on the southern border. The Islamic State has been on the southern border. Al-Shabaab out of Somalia in Africa has been especially active on our southern border. So this is not a fantasy. It's not a myth. This is real.
So when we see the picture on the mainstream media, we see pictures of the migrant caravan that is camped out in Tijuana, Mexico, directly across from the United States. And we see the media speaking of people who are trying to come into this country. We're given the impression that we're given the impression, which is incorrect on its face, that this is just women with children trying to, escape horrific, oppressive governments in Latin America. But you talk about, it's been shown that a good percentage of the people that are trying to cross are working age young men. It's not women with children, but it's actually young men. But you talk about in your article something called Other Than Mexican, an acronym that's been adapted for illegal aliens. So talk about that a little bit.
Right. The general impression that a lot of people have is that everybody who's coming across our southern border is from Mexico. That is not the truth at all. There is a whole category of individuals known as OTMs, other than Mexicans. Within that category, there is a subcategory called Special Interest Aliens, SIAs, SIA OTMs, Special Interest Aliens other than Mexicans. And the Special Interest Aliens are from 34 listed countries of terrorism concern. And this is a category that's been around for decades. It's got nothing to do with President Trump. This is what our border security apparatus has identified as a particular threat to our country with regard not just to border security, but overall immigration security. And these countries of terrorism concern, most of your listeners could probably name them. They primarily happen to be Islamic nations, because if you look at the countries of primarily of terrorism concern, they're all Islamic nations. And I think in law enforcement, that is what is known as a clue. And so as a result, because of the thousands of special interest aliens that have come across the southern border of the United States, we have a jihadist threat down there.
So let me ask you this, Christopher. Christopher Holton is our guest today with the Center for Security Policy. So would these be individuals that present themselves for asylum, or would they be in the past have presented themselves for asylum, been processed, and then released on their own recognizance, basically, which is basically released into the wild within the United States, but unknown about their whereabouts? Would those people have come seeking asylum and been released, or would those people be people who have breached the lack of security at the border?
The answer to your question is yes. The answer to the question is that they fall into both categories.
Okay.
And in fact, I think there was one example cited in my article of two jihadis who came in. One was immediately arrested and apprehended. The other one applied for asylum and was granted a hearing and then absconded.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no record of whatever happened to that guy. He might still be in the United States for all we know. So it happens in both ways.
Okay.
And if you go back to the 9/11 hijackers, a lot of these 9/11 hijackers, a good portion of them, were on student visas, and their visas had expired, and they had just decided to stay in the country, which is very common as well. So, look, our whole immigration system is indeed need of reform, just not the kind of reform that the left wants to do. And the left, of course, isn't concerned about border security, which is the most fundamental aspect of reform that needs to be done if we're going to reform our immigration system.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left, Christopher. What do you see as, do you have any prediction as to how all this is going to be resolved and the implications of not resolving it in a way that would be consistent with President Trump's campaign promises?
You know, I don't have a prediction on that because when it comes to politics, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. I can tell you this, I could care less about the government shutdown. They can keep that portion of the government shut down until the cows come home for all I care, because this is a national security issue. And until we get this resolved, and we have had multiple administrations, multiple Congresses now ignore this problem and ignore this threat for decades. And now President Trump is serious about addressing this threat. Mm-hmm. And it's got Washington, D.C. riled up. Mm-hmm. He's a non-establishment politician, and the establishment is riled up. And so I hope that he sticks to his guns. I don't have a prediction on how this is going to turn out because it's politics, and I'm not an expert in politics.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Christopher Holton of the Center for Security Policy. We have a link to his article that he wrote and that we've been discussing. We'll have that on our website, plus the other website he mentioned, understandingthethreat.com. So go to afano.org after the show, and it'll be there for you immediately after the show. Christopher, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to our next discussion.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.